Hello, and everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on clinical trial disruptions from COVID-19. We're really excited to have you guys join us today to talk about a pretty pressing and important topic about how an important part of the drug development process has been disrupted because of the issues that we're facing around the world because of the pandemic. So today we've hosted and put together this webinar to be able to help talk about some of the challenges ongoing, brings together some industry experts and create a forum for you to be able to discuss some of the things that are going on with your trial and get some feedback. So just to quickly kick us off here, my name is Alok Tai. I'm the VP of Life Sciences here at Ignite. My responsibility here is to serve the 400 or so life science customers we have at the company and be able to help support our customers in that domain with new products, services, offerings, things of that nature. So I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I'm really excited to have as our guest speaker, Rahul Chaturvedi, who's the CEO of Clora. Rahul, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Alok. Thanks for having me.
Maybe to kick us off, love it if you could give us a quick intro on your background, maybe tell us a little bit about Clora, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sounds great. I'm currently the CEO and founder of Clora. We're a two-sided marketplace where we're organizing and providing access to worldwide life sciences expertise with the application of technology. Prior to that, the last 15, 16 years or so, I was VP of clinical development at a number of different biotech and medical device companies across a range of therapeutic areas from type 2 diabetes, obesity. Did quite a bit of work in ophthalmology as well as in oncology.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. Obviously, have a lot of experience in clinical trials and clinical development, and so eager to hear a little bit about your perspective on what's been happening with COVID and how companies can prepare for it. So before we get into some of the meat of the discussion, just wanted to quickly review the outline that we've got set aside today. We're going to sort of kick off the discussion here in a minute, focusing first on some of the trends we're seeing in the industry, especially in the context of disruptions related to COVID. Second, Rahul will sort of share a framework that he sort of developed around thinking about the risk to your specific programs, especially from a clinical development perspective. And then also share with you some guidance on what specific activities you and your team can pursue today as you're thinking about keeping your trials and programs on track, as well as those that might be upcoming in the future. We'll then close out with some key takeaways, some Q&A, as well as some resources for you to review in the future. So with that, maybe we'll turn over to you, Rahul, to maybe give us a quick sense of some of the observations you're making across the life sciences domain, especially in the context of clinical trials.
Yeah, sure. So COVID-19 is having an unprecedented impact on clinical trials across the world. We as an industry have never faced many of the challenges that we're now facing, and specifically as it relates to clinical trials and the heavy machinery that is involved in running clinical trials has been disrupted quite a bit. And I think there's lots to deal with that we as clinical development experts have never had to deal with before. But I'd also encourage a lot of us to now just think about the opportunity that is afforded to us with potentially pausing a number of the programs that we were all involved in. Some of the trends that I've been observing is that effectively across the US, many clinical trials have stopped enrollment, given all the various cities across the US that have shelters at home in place now. Based on what we've seen in China, and China is, I'd say, a couple of weeks, if not 1 to 2 months ahead of us in terms of dealing with the pandemic, what China saw was that there was an 83% decrease in patients entering clinical trials, year-over-year difference in February 2020 compared to February 2019. So I think we should all expect to see something very similar in terms of clinical trial recruitments in the US. I think additionally, adjustments have to be made in terms of participation in clinical trials on a risk-benefit assessment. And so I'm happy to just start there, where patient safety has always been the primary area of focus in clinical trials and ensuring that patients are being kept safe. And there might be certain situations where patients should be coming off of investigational product, and in other instances where that might not be the safe thing to do. And so I think first and foremost, for those that have active clinical trials running, rapidly assessing patient safety and the impact on patient safety with various different contingency plans that you're coming up with. Second is providers that we all work with to ensure the successful completion of clinical trials. So there's an entire ecosystem of CROs, data managers, regulatory experts, supply chain, CDMOs, et cetera, et cetera. And those have all been impacted as well. And one thing to make sure is that you've been actively talking to all service providers that are serving your clinical trial operations and ensuring that they have plans in place to deal with what's going on right now. And no one that I am aware of has dealt with anything like this previously. And so we're all learning as we're going. But I think what's really important is really active communication, as almost all of us are working from home right now, really active communication and documentation of that communication decision-making process that you're following as it relates to patient safety, patient visits, and overall conduct of the clinical trial. And then lastly, all of these are going to have downstream impact on timelines, and starting to think about what impact, let's say things like supply chain, are going to feel, specifically around the investigational product that, let's say you were anticipating a 1-year enrollment period, and now that's pushed out 6 months to a year potentially. Is your clinical supply still going to be able to be used in the clinical trial setting? How are patients going to maintain IP accountability if they're not coming into the clinical site? In addition, things like analysis of data. I think we'll see significant increases in protocol deviations and how you want to deal with missing data points, and really thinking through the downstream impact of all of these. And there will certainly be compounding effects that these disruptions will have on database lock and when you can actually begin to analyze this data, and really encourage everyone to unpack from a regulatory perspective, from a patient recruitment perspective, what sites you should be working with, how are patients going to effectively communicate with your PIs, is telehealth an option? How are you going to collect samples? And really thinking about, and every clinical trial is unique. And what I'm hoping to do is create a framework by which we can all share and hopefully do this in an open source format where we're improving the quality of this framework over time to address all clinical trial disruptions due to COVID-19. And so next we'll talk a little bit about the clinical trial process, and the framework that we've developed breaks it down into those programs that are currently in study startup. So you haven't enrolled a patient yet, you're just starting to think about activating clinical sites, you haven't recruited any patients, nor are there any patients on investigational product. Then the next step are those that are actively enrolling and making a determination as to whether enrollment should continue and whether that's in the best interest of the patients in the trial, depending on the patient population that you're going after, as well as the disease state, or whether you should halt enrollment. And then thinking about, well, what should you do with those patients that are already enrolled in the trial? Should they continue on investigational product, or does the risk outweigh the benefit at this point? And then lastly, the third tier would be those folks where enrollment has been completed, and perhaps you're lucky in the sense that now it's just patient follow-up, but still continuing to maintain patient safety and thinking about how do we actually monitor these sites. And I think we're in an age now where most clinical trials are being conducted and using EDC platforms and CTMS platforms. So communication infrastructure is dramatically different than it was a decade ago, and that's to our benefit. But really thinking about remote monitoring and how will you address things like IP accountability? Is there an opportunity to perhaps deploy digital health sensors that you hadn't previously thought about? And is FDA going to be more willing to accept some of those trade-offs that come with maintaining patient safety, perhaps being a bit more forward thinking around what technology you might be able to deploy in your active clinical trials given the current situation?
Awesome. Super helpful. Now that you've sort of walked us through some of the observations that you're starting to see across the industry in terms of how COVID has sort of impacted the different steps of the clinical trial process specifically, would love it if you could share with us, your framework of how you think about some of the risks that are ongoing, especially if you were to put yourself in the shoes of someone on a clinical development team with, say, an active trial or one upcoming.
Yeah, sure. So the way that we think about the framework would be both thinking about those activities that are internal to you as a sponsor company or perhaps a CRO, as well as those that are external. And as I mentioned before, I think first and foremost is patient safety. Then next up would be maintaining site staff and employee safety, and thinking about, is it still worthwhile for patients to be coming in? Are we putting our investigators and our clinical site coordinators at risk as well? And then thinking about, all right, we want to minimize the impact that the current situation has on clinical trial integrity and data collection, and how do we maintain GCP in this very dynamic environment where it seems like almost every day there's a change that's occurring in terms of how we dealing with this. Now, all of those have downstream effects to things like budgets and to access of data and to how we communicate with service providers. And the way that I would recommend folks think about it is patients, then clinical sites, and then thinking about clinical supply chain and what impact any disruptions due to COVID-19 are going to have on those three key components.
Thanks so much for sharing that set of insights there, especially in the context of some of the challenges companies see externally. Any chance you could also share with us some of the issues that those companies might face internally as they start to reforecast or replan in this new environment?
Yeah, so I think there has to be a realization by executives and their investors that timelines have changed. And we're really unsure of when clinical sites will, let's say, open up for operation. And I think the best thing that leaders in clinical can do right now is develop whatever framework you think works given your trial, and come up with contingency plans where there's a best case scenario of which sites may open up first based on the spread of the disease in any particular region. And then worst case scenarios, so that you're providing, I think it's on us as clinical development leaders to help executives at the company think about the trade-offs and what is impacted. And as I was mentioning, there's going to be compounding effects across the way, where let's say if you were getting API from China, and now that API has been delayed to your GMP manufacturer. Now, that obviously delays when you can start your clinical study, but then that also has downstream effects in terms of budgetary implications. And I think the best thing that we can do at this point is come up with contingency plans and both aggressive as well as conservative estimates around what the true impact is on your program.
So, as you sort of think about that framework and its application to companies' current environments, what activities do you encourage folks to pursue today that enable them to triage their current issues, but then also prep for the future?
So I'd break this down into four key activities. There's the regulatory interactions, either with, let's say, FDA and or with individual IRBs. There's patient interactions and how do you maintain patient safety, as I was mentioning. Then there's site interactions of clinical trial sites have obviously not dealt with anything like this before, and making sure that you're communicating best practices, perhaps from other sites to these investigators and coordinators. And then there's disruptions in supply chain. And what we can do is unpack each of these within a few minutes. So in terms of regulatory interactions, FDA has already released guidance around how clinical sites as well as sponsors should be thinking about these disruptions. You're now able to effect changes in protocols, particularly when it relates to patient safety, without having to get approval from the IRB or having to submit protocol amendments to your IND. So that's a good step forward. In terms of regulatory interactions, you should be thinking about redesigning protocols, or if you're in the process of kicking off a trial, designing your protocols and all other essential documents, including informed consents, et cetera, to enable maximum flexibility, because we don't know how long this is going to go on, and making sure that patient visits are only when it's hypercritical, that patient comes in, and you're effectively developing plans where sample collection and perhaps use of some of these digital sensors, et cetera, can enrich patient data without them having to come into the office, and obviously leveraging things like patient diaries and such. and proactively communicating all of these changes that you're making with your IRB as well as with FDA. A number of IRBs have come up with process that they would like followed given the context of this pandemic. So I'd encourage you to just make sure that you're up to speed with all the various IRBs that you're likely working with and what they've done in terms of process improvements and process refinements given the current situation. In terms of patient interactions, I'd encourage folks to think about alternative ways to assess patient safety and then obviously efficacy and as it relates to primary and secondary endpoints. Make a determination as to whether study participation should continue or should it be discontinued. And then on a region by region basis, assess whether, and this goes to site interactions, assess whether clinical sites should remain open for enrollment or whether enrollment should be halted on a region by region basis. I'd also encourage now, this ties to patient interactions as well as site interactions, exploring telehealth alternatives. So there's been a dramatic increase in the proliferation of telehealth in medicine, and a number of states have passed laws that enable you now to see patients virtually. So understanding what is allowed on a site-by-site basis might be another option to reduce patient interactions while maintaining patient safety. And then lastly, it's sample collection. So there's all the folks that are well equipped to collect samples. Number of those folks are now coming up with new process around how to collect samples, perhaps at the patient level, rather than having to collect it at sites. So encourage you to talk to whoever your provider is on the sample collection side to chat with them about what new process they have implemented to ensure sample collection and maintain the integrity of that sample. And then lastly, it's clinical supply chain, which I hinted at a little bit before, which was, for example, if your investigational product is self-administered, then you're obviously in a much better position than if not, and perhaps there's continuity of care and continuity of dosing if it is self-administered. Clearly, communicating with patients what they should be doing with used investigational product, starting to think about expiration dates and how long this investigational product is good for, and perhaps chatting with your CMC colleagues to determine a contingency plan if more product needs to be manufactured. And then lastly, during all of this, it's still important to maintain IP accountability and ensuring that both patients and sites are aware of what the implications are of maintaining IP accountability, even given disruptions in the trial.
So, as you look to the future and as companies, hope to come out of this weird situation, in the coming months, how could they take advantage of this extra time that they have to support their future programs?
Yeah. So I mentioned at the start of the webinar how there might be opportunities here to perhaps improve the quality of data long term in your clinical trial. And oftentimes we have to rush to the starting line of any clinical trial, and there's always room for improvement in terms of what process you put into place, or did you get all the right data queries, did you do enough user testing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is an opportunity to potentially pause, depending on the clinical trial, to potentially pause, zoom out a little bit, and assess what has gone right in the trial so far and where there's room for improvement. And so a couple of ideas here to encourage discourse. One is patient recruitment. So even though most trials are going to pause enrollment in the US, I think you can use this as an opportunity to potentially experiment with patient recruitment. The reason I bring this up is right now social media usage, given that the majority of Americans are at home right now, social media usage has skyrocketed. And is there an opportunity for you to potentially experiment with some clinical trial recruitment strategies that you had been thinking about, where you might think that there's a particular cohort of patients in, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever social media platform that you were thinking about that might have your patients, start to run relatively inexpensive ads, let's say, to try to acquire new patients. And then maybe take it a step further where, for certain trials, you might still be able to pre-screen patients obviously pending IRB approval, et cetera. But use this as an opportunity to now start to build up a backlog of patients that when the floodgates do open and clinical trial sites perhaps are open for business again, use this as an opportunity to build that pool of consultants that you could then dramatically increase enrollment rates by building this backlog up. Second would be data integrity, and using this as an opportunity to clean up all the data that's been collected so far. And perhaps you may need to make changes in terms of how certain data is collected because you're seeing certain gaps in data collection, or you're seeing that there's lots of protocol deviations, et cetera. So use this as a time to zoom out again and look at what's happened in the trial so far and where are there areas of improvement, so that when the trial is fully enrolled, you've done all that you can to ensure trial integrity. And then lastly, addressing talent gaps. So I've heard a number of companies have now put hiring freezes in place for full-time employees. And that certainly doesn't change the gaps that you likely have on your team. And think about how you can address those talent gaps during this period of pause. So for example, you might have said that, I wish I had a different clinical trial monitor. Start to potentially source additional clinical trial monitors that you think could improve the quality of data collection. Something else would be, think about the impact on statistical analysis. And you potentially need a biostatistician that's really creative around missing data points and has a lot of experience with running analyses with missing data points. That's another one. You could think about medical writers if you're making lots of changes to your protocol, or your IB is going to need revisions, et cetera. That's something else. So really think about how can you fill gaps on your team and augment your team without having to bring on full-time employees. So really this concept of fractionalized labor on.
Perfect. Well, appreciate you sort of walking through, maybe in some of the bright spots in terms of getting a better internal posture and getting some of the historical things that were ignored and postponed, back to the forefront and to be ready for the next phase of a trial. So, as you think about that subsequent set of steps and some of the ways in which companies need to be thinking about potentially a filing or looking for approval, obviously these disruptions are certainly changing the way that companies need to be thinking about their interactions with regulatory authorities. Can you help us sort of focus in on what specific aspects of that interaction, regulator, sponsor sort of interaction, companies should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the patient safety piece because we've covered it quite a bit. I think what will be extremely important through all of this is that sponsors and CROs and clinical sites made sure that patient safety was of the highest importance. I don't think there will be much leeway given from FDA, if that's even a thing. But obviously, I don't think there'll be lots of leeway given to sponsor companies that felt like patient safety wasn't of the highest order. And so I think above and beyond all else, make sure that that's done. I think the second thing around data integrity is, I imagine that any clinical trials that are running right now are going to have more missed patient visits and more missing data points than at any period of time before. And I think FDA is going to have to work, and I believe this will be the case, will have to work with sponsor companies to determine how to deal with missing data. And there's lots of different statistical techniques that can be used, and heavily dependent on your patient population and the length of trial and the mode of administration and so on. Making sure that you are also thinking about how you'd like analysis to be run on missing data points, and be forward looking there and try to think about where the puck is headed around data integrity. And then lastly, around new geographies, I would at this point encourage everyone to think about potentially getting clinical sites up and running in less impacted regions. For example, in New York, you're likely not going to have any clinical trials running in most patient populations for quite some time. But is there an opportunity now for you to think about ramping up in China in the next month to 2 months, or Singapore or South Korea, or some of these other geographies that have a handle on the situation, so that you're mitigating your risk, particularly here in the US and certainly parts of Europe. The key question to think about here is how willing FDA will be to accept clinical trial data from many of these other geographies and encourage you to start trying to at least have some of those conversations with FDA sooner rather than later.
So, given that sort of synopsis, really appreciate you walking us through, the higher level of how companies can continue to progress their programs despite some of these disruptions and issues. So, would you mind maybe just sort of summarizing real quick, the key takeaways that the audience should walk away with, and what sort of salient points you think are most important?
Yeah, sure. So I think first and foremost, maintaining patient safety, and that's the most important. I'd also encourage folks to be opportunistic and think about what they wish they had done at the start of the trial. And now this is an opportunity for you to build a plane, perhaps where you're flying slower than you previously were, but build a plane as you're flying it. And I think use this opportunity as best you can to do so. I'd encourage folks to reassess their current service providers if folks were underperforming, or even individual resources at those service providers that you might want to swap out. And then going back to this concept about fractionalized labor, and your company may have put a freeze on hiring, but the gaps on your team certainly still exist. And think about how you can fill those gaps with innovative new ways of bringing on talent that's the right talent at the right time in order to make sure that you're not involving yourself in riskier development than you already need to, and by surrounding yourself with the right folks. And then lastly, what I would say is that you want to make sure that communication and documentation is A+ across your team, as well as all the various service providers. And there's lots of decisions being made within companies at this point that are deviations from the protocol, and you're having to get lots of opinions from medical monitors and pharmacovigilance teams, et cetera, et cetera. And now more than ever, documentation and clear communication and directions to site is extremely important, given how disrupted most clinical trials are right now. And then lastly, I'd encourage folks just experiment. Now is a great time to be experimenting with new things. The world is going to be quite different when clinical trial sites are open for business, and now is the time to really think about how am I going to speed up patient recruitment? What could I have done differently in order to optimize the end result, which is wrapping up the trial as quickly as possible when the floodgates do open, because they will open soon.
So, to wrap up here, love it if we can sort of go to the chat box and see if we can answer some questions coming from the audience.
Great.
So let's see here. The first question we've got from the audience is, what impacts will this have long-term on the clinical trial landscape?
Yeah, so most of my experience has been at early stage biotechs, and I can speak from that lens. I think one key impact is that risk mitigation based on geography and supply chain disruptions will now need to be a really important conversation, even at the earliest stage biotechs. I know mid-sized biotechs and big pharma have entire processes around this, but I think at early stage biotechs, we often forget about risk mitigation based on geography, or if a particular provider is no longer able to make API, et cetera. And I think this will force early stage companies to think about risk mitigation in clinical trials more so than they have been, and perhaps level up in terms of sophistication. So I think that's one key one. I think the other one that I'm hoping for is that the advent and proliferation of telemedicine, and we're being forced into this right now across healthcare, but that has a downstream effect on clinical trials where patients perhaps don't need to come in as often as they have historically, and you can still maintain patient safety with some of your clinical trial sites bringing on some telehealth providers. I think that might be an interesting long-term positive impact, and that might also drive down the costs of some of the clinical trials that we conduct as well.
So last question we've got here, just given the brief time we've got, is in the midst of a hiring freeze, how do I get access to the right expertise to help handle my regulatory strategy?
So there's no regulatory expert that has dealt with anything like this previously. So I'll start off with that. And so what you want to make sure is that you have a creative strategist that you can tap into. Big reason that I started Clora was I was constantly facing gaps that I had on my team. And I wish I had a way to augment my team on an as needed basis as some of these questions come up. And I think that's more pertinent now than ever before. I would encourage you to, I think, firstly, perhaps reach out to your network and see if folks are there. But perhaps give Clora a try. We have 5,000 plus consultants on platform right now, many of whom have significant expertise in regulatory strategy. But really think about up-leveling your team at this point, and think about what are complementary pieces that you could bring on right now that can help you deal with this unprecedented disruption in your program.
Well, Rahul, really appreciate you sort of tackling some of those questions. Before we close out, we'll just sort of tab to a quick slide to share some resources and guidance in this trying time. Rahul, any sort of commentary you want to add maybe to some of these links here?
So FDA has come out with guidance. Would encourage everyone to take a look at that. I'd also say that many IRBs have come up with their own guidance about how they're dealing with it. So make sure that you're checking with your IRB. And this is such a dynamic situation. So I think Twitter has been a great resource in terms of getting quick access to this dynamic environment. So I'd encourage folks to even log into Twitter and follow folks that you respect highly on Twitter that might be sharing day-to-day updates on the changing clinical trial landscape.
Perfect. Well, with that, Rahul, would love to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, and hope to have you on again soon, especially as we hopefully emerge from this pandemic and see how the world of drug development has changed.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alok.